The morning she arrived in Paris on a quiet Tuesday in April, not a grand Tuesday, not the kind that announces itself with fanfare or bright skis or the particular electricity that sometimes crackles through a morning when you know something important is about to happen. No, this Tuesday was soft, unhurried, the kind of morning that arrives gently, like someone placing a warm hand on your shoulder without saying a word. The sky was the color of old linen, pale and a little washed out, holding the memory of last night's rain the way fabric holds the ghost of a perfume long after the wearer has left the room. She had landed at Charles de Gaulle just after 6 in the morning. The flight had been long, the kind of long that exists outside of ordinary time, where the hours blur together, and the world outside the small oval window is nothing but a vast and featureless dark. She had not slept well. She rarely did on planes. She had sat with her forehead close to the cold glass, watching the faint shimmer of city lights far below, scattered across the earth like embers that had fallen from something much brighter. She had drunk 2 small cups of weak tea. She had read 3 pages of a novel and then given up. She had simply sat quietly with her hands folded in her lap, existing somewhere between wakefulness and the very softest edges of sleep. That warm, blurred country where thoughts lose their sharpness and everything feels a little like a dream. Her name was Leia. She was 34 years old, though some mornings she felt both older and younger than that. Older in the way her body sometimes ached with a tiredness that sleep did not quite fix. Younger in the way certain things could still make her breath catch with a sudden, unguarded joy. A field of lavender seen from a train window, the smell of rain on warm stone, a piece of music heard unexpectedly from an open window. She was the kind of person who noticed things, small things, quiet things, the kind of things that most people walked past without a second glance. This was not something she had cultivated deliberately. It was simply how she had always been, attentive, still, quietly present in a world that often moved too fast for her. She came from a small town, the kind where everyone knew which house you grew up in and which teacher had been hardest on you at school. A town of low rooftops and long winters and summer evenings that stretched so slowly toward the dark that you could almost believe night would never come. She had lived there all her life. Not unhappily, she had loved it in the way you love something familiar and safe, the way you love the sound of a door closing in a house you have always known. But there are some dreams that a small town cannot hold for you. Some dreams are too wide, too restless. They need more sky. This trip to Paris had been one of those dreams. She had carried it with her for years, folded carefully somewhere inside herself, not in any dramatic way, not the way people carry a longing that burns and aches, more the way you keep a letter you have been meaning to send, tucking it away in a coat pocket or a drawer, telling yourself soon, one day, when the time is right. And somehow, this April, the time had quietly become right. There had been no grand decision, no sudden burst of courage. One evening, she had simply sat down at her small kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and opened her laptop. And 40 minutes later, she had a flight booked and a small hotel reserved on a narrow lane in Montmartre. And she had closed the laptop and sat for a long moment in the yellow light of her kitchen, feeling the particular and delicate weight of something that had finally, gently, been set in motion. She had told almost no one. This was deliberate. She had wanted to keep it close to herself for a little while, the way you cup a small flame against the wind, not because you are afraid of sharing it, but because some things need to be felt fully before they are spoken aloud. Her neighbor had noticed her suitcase in the hallway and asked, and she had smiled and said simply, "Paris." And her neighbor had said, "Oh, how lovely," and that had been that. No fuss, no elaborate explanations, just Paris, held lightly in the mouth like a sweet. The taxi from the airport moved slowly through the early city. The driver was a quiet man with kind eyes and no particular interest in conversation, which suited her perfectly. She sat in the back seat with her bag on her lap and watched Paris arrive through the window, the way you might watch a piece of music slowly come into focus. First, the distant shapes of it, blurred and general, and then, gradually, the details, the specific and individual details that no photograph had quite prepared her for. The streets were still mostly empty at that hour. There was something deeply peaceful about a city in its early morning state, before the noise and the crowds and the particular energetic hum that fills a place when thousands of people are all awake and moving and wanting things at once. Paris at 6:30 in the morning was a different thing entirely. It was quieter than she had expected, more intimate. The buildings stood close on either side of the road, their pale stone faces catching the thin gray light and giving it back softly, like walls that have absorbed 100 years of mornings and learned how to hold them gently. She passed a bakery. The light inside was the color of warm honey, amber and soft, spilling out through the glass onto the wet pavement in a long, wavering rectangle. Through the window, she could see shelves of bread, a woman in a white apron moving behind the counter, the ghost of steam rising from something freshly baked. The smell did not reach her inside the taxi, but she imagined it, that particular and irreplaceable smell of bread in the early morning, yeasty and warm and faintly sweet, the smell of something simple and necessary being made with care. She pressed her fingers lightly against the cool glass of the taxi window and watched the bakery slide past and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. A small, quiet release, like the first breath after holding one for too long. She passed a woman walking a dog. The dog was gray, a small, soft thing with ears that flopped forward and a tail that moved in a slow, contented arc. The woman was wearing a long coat the color of moss and walking with the unhurried confidence of someone who has done this same walk every morning for 20 years and knows every cobblestone by feel. The dog paused to sniff at the base of a lamp post. The woman waited without impatience, her hands in her pockets, her face turned slightly upward, as if she were listening to something in the air that no one else could hear. They were a small and perfect picture, the two of them, dog and woman, morning and lamp post, the wet street reflecting everything in long, wavering lines of light. She passed a florist. He was young or youngish, with a scarf tucked loosely around his neck and a cigarette behind his ear that he had forgotten about or was saving for later. He was arranging bunches of pale lilac in a wooden cart outside his shop, holding each bunch briefly up to the light before placing it with a kind of casual precision that spoke of long practice. The lilac was the most beautiful thing she had seen so far that morning. Those loose, drooping clusters of tiny purple-white flowers, improbably delicate, carrying even from a distance the suggestion of a fragrance so sweet and green and clean that it seemed almost too good to belong to the real world. She watched him work for the few seconds the taxi allowed her, and she thought, without quite knowing why, that she would like to come back and buy a bunch before she left, to carry that smell home with her, to hold it a little longer. Paris, she thought, does not announce itself. It simply waits. She had read things about Paris before she came. Everyone had. She had seen the photographs, the films, the postcards. She had heard it described 100 different ways by 100 different people, some of whom had been there, and some of whom had only imagined it. And now she was here, actually here, moving through the real streets of the actual city. And what surprised her most was not that it was beautiful, she had expected beauty, but that it was so ordinary in its beauty, so unperforming. The buildings did not seem to know they were famous. The streets did not seem to be trying. Everything simply was what it was, quietly and without apology, and the beauty of it came from that. From the complete absence of effort, the way a face is most lovely when it is not thinking about being looked at. The taxi turned into a narrower street, and then another, climbing slightly, the road rising gently beneath them in the way that Montmartre roads do, with a kind of slow, patient insistence, as if the hill knows where it is going and is in no hurry to prove it. The hotel was small. She had known this from the photographs on the booking website. But photographs have a way of flattening things, of making small spaces look either larger or more charming than they turn out to be. In this case, the reality was better than the photograph. The building was narrow and old, 3 stories of pale cream stone with dark green shutters, and a wooden door whose paint had worn away at the edges in a way that felt intentional, like the faded hem of a well-loved dress. There were window boxes on the 2nd floor, empty now, but for a few dried stalks from last autumn's flowers, waiting quietly for someone to fill them again with something living. A small brass plaque beside the door said the name of the hotel in letters so worn they were barely legible. She paid the driver. He handed her a receipt without being asked, which she found quietly endearing. That small professional courtesy, automatic and kind. She stepped out of the taxi, and then she stood still. This was something she did sometimes when she arrived somewhere new. Simply stopped and stood for a moment before doing anything else. Before looking at her phone, before checking in, before thinking about what came next. She stood on the cobblestones of the narrow lane with her bag at her feet, and she breathed, just breathed, in and out, slowly, the way you breathe when you are finally somewhere you have wanted to be for a long time, and you do not want to rush past the moment of arrival. The air was cool and damp from last night's rain. It smelled of wet stone and something faintly green, moss, perhaps, or the young leaves on the trees she could see at the end of the lane, beginning to unfurl in that tentative, hopeful way that April leaves do, as if they are not quite sure yet that spring has fully committed to staying. There was the distant sound of a church bell, not close, not intrusive, just present, measuring out a single clear note that hung in the cool air and then slowly dissolved, the way a drop of ink dissolves in water, spreading and softening until it is gone. A pigeon landed on the cobblestones a few feet away. It regarded her briefly with one round orange eye, found her neither threatening nor interesting, and turned its attention to a small piece of something pale it had spotted near the wall. She watched it for a moment, the businesslike tilt of its head, the iridescent shimmer of the feathers at its neck, green and violet and blue all at once, like a small piece of sky that had fallen to earth and learned to walk. Pigeons, she had always thought, were unfairly maligned. There was something in their complete self-possession that she found deeply admirable. She picked up her bag. The woman at the reception desk was small and gray-haired and wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She smiled when Leah came through the door, a real smile, not a professional one, the kind that reaches the eyes and stays there a moment after the lips have settled. She spoke in French, and Leah's French was uncertain and full of gaps, but the woman was patient and gentle with it, the way a good teacher is patient with a student who is trying hard, not finishing her sentences for her, but waiting quietly while she found her way through them. The room would be ready later in the morning, she explained. But Leia was welcome to leave her bag and walk. The city was just outside. It had been waiting. She left her bag. She walked back out into the lane. And Paris was just outside, exactly as promised, cool and quiet and unhurried. The cobblestones still faintly wet. The sky beginning to lighten, almost imperceptibly towards something warmer. The morning settling slowly around her like a coat she was just learning to wear. She had no plans. This had been intentional. She had deliberately resisted the impulse to make an itinerary, to fill the days with things to see and places to be, to optimize the trip the way people sometimes optimize trips, until the joy has been efficiently scheduled out of them. She had brought a small notebook and a pen. She had brought comfortable shoes. She had brought a patience she had been practicing for years. That was all she needed. That was, she had come to believe, all anyone truly needed. A willingness to be somewhere fully, without the constant forward pull of what comes next. She walked to the end of the lane. She looked left, where the street curved away downhill between close-set buildings, and right, where it rose gently toward something she could not yet see. She chose right, without deliberation, simply because the morning light seemed slightly warmer in that direction, or perhaps because she had always been the kind of person who chose upward when given the choice. The cobblestones were uneven beneath her feet, and she was glad of her sensible shoes. This was not a place for elegance, or not that kind of elegance, not the high-heeled, polished kind. The elegance of Montmartre was rougher and older and more honest than that. It was the elegance of imperfection worn with ease. The crumbling plaster that no one had bothered to patch because it had become, in its crumbling, a kind of texture. The iron railings gone soft with rust along their edges. The vine growing out of a crack in the wall of someone's courtyard. Its young leaves reaching in 4 different directions, with the uncontained enthusiasm of something that has found a crack in the world and decided to live there. She walked slowly. She let herself look at everything. A doorway painted dark red, its paint blistered in small bubbles near the bottom where the winter damp had gotten in. A window on the 2nd floor where a woman's arm rested on the sill, just the arm, bare to the elbow, the hand loose and relaxed, a coffee cup balanced in the fingers, and the intimate, accidental beauty of that image, that small domestic moment glimpsed from the street, a whole life suggested by a hand and a cup and a window, a narrow passage between 2 buildings that opened unexpectedly into a small courtyard with a single stone bench and a tree not yet fully in bloom, its branches casting thin, lacy shadows on the ground in the pale morning light. She stopped at the passage. She looked in. She did not enter. It felt too private for that, too much like someone's own secret. but she stood at the entrance for a moment and looked, and felt the particular and specific happiness of discovering a small hidden thing in a large city. The happiness of the accidental, the unplanned, the thing that reveals itself only to those who are moving slowly enough to see it. She walked on. The morning was fully awake now, though still gentle. The light had shifted from pale gray to something warmer and more golden, and the smell of the city had changed too, enriched by the rising temperature, layered and complex. Coffee and bread and old stone, and somewhere faintly, that green spring smell of wet earth and new leaves that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The smell of the season simply existing, quietly and without announcement, doing its slow and necessary work. She passed a small epicery, its display of fruit and vegetables arranged outside with a care that bordered on art, oranges stacked in a perfect pyramid, bunches of radishes tied with string, a crate of strawberries so red and concentrated in their redness that they looked almost unreal, like something from a painting rather than a market stall. She paused. She bought 3 strawberries from the young man behind the display. Paying with coins she pulled from the small pocket of her jacket. He handed them to her in a fold of paper, and she ate them standing there on the pavement, one by one, slowly. They were extraordinary, or perhaps she was simply paying the kind of attention to them that strawberries deserve, but rarely receive, eaten quickly, without thought, on the way to something else. These 3 strawberries had her full and unhurried attention. The first was sweet and a little sharp. The second was softer, warmer from sitting in the morning light. The third was the best, deeply, quietly sweet in a way that seemed to fill the whole mouth and linger there. A flavor that stayed even after it was gone. She licked the juice from her fingers. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her pocket. She walked on, and Paris continued to be exactly what it was, not performing, not trying, not asking anything of her, just existing in that particular unhurried way of old cities that have seen enough of time to know that rushing through it solves nothing. The morning light fell across the pale stone buildings and the wet cobblestones and the young spring leaves with an equal and impartial grace. The pigeons walked their slow, purposeful circles. Somewhere a radio was playing something soft and indistinct, not quite identifiable as a song, just music, just sound, just the warm murmur of a city beginning its day. She thought very quietly, with no drama at all, I am here. And then she thought, that is enough. She stood for a moment at a small crossroads where 4 narrow streets met at slightly odd angles, the kind of intersection that maps do not quite capture. The actuality of it, the slight slope of the ground, the way 2 of the streets were in shadow and 2 in light, the way the morning seemed to be happening differently in each direction. She turned her face toward the light. She breathed in. She felt the cool April air fill her lungs completely, and then slowly leave, taking with it something she had been carrying for a long time, some small and unnamed weight that she had grown so accustomed to that she had stopped noticing it was there. The hotel was behind her. The city was ahead. She had nowhere to be, and all the time in the world to get there. She walked on. The morning held her gently, the way Paris holds everything, without grasping, without urgency, without the need to make anything more than it already is. Just the cobblestones beneath her feet and the soft light on the old stone walls and the April air and the very simple, very complete feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She walked on, and the city, in its quiet and unhurried way, walked with her. Rest now. Let the cobblestones carry you. Let Paris hold you gently tonight. Crescent moon, the cobblestones of Montmartre. She did not go back to the hotel. Not yet. Not when the morning was this soft, this unhurried, this entirely and perfectly willing to be walked through slowly. The city had offered itself to her without condition. No map required, no agenda, no particular destination. And she accepted the offer the way you accept an unexpected kindness, quietly, with both hands open, and with a gratitude too genuine to be spoken aloud. She simply walked. This was something she had always known how to do, not walking as exercise, not walking as transportation, not walking with the focused and purposeful stride of someone who has somewhere to be and a limited amount of time to get there. She walked the way she had walked as a child, when she did not yet know that time was a thing to be managed. Slowly, attentively, with the whole body present in the act of moving, not just the legs, but the eyes, the ears, the skin, the particular and wordless intelligence that lives somewhere in the chest and knows, without being told, when something is worth stopping for. Montmartre, she was already beginning to understand, was a place built for exactly this kind of walking. It was not like the grand boulevards she had glimpsed from the taxi, those wide, symmetrical avenues with their ordered rows of trees and their confident sense of their own importance. Montmartre was something older and less certain of itself, less polished, more layered. It was a place that had been built gradually over centuries by people who were not thinking about grandeur, but about living, about fitting a house between two other houses, about running a lane between a garden wall and a bakery, about letting streets follow the natural shape of the hill rather than imposing any artificial geometry upon it. The result was a neighborhood that could not be understood from above, from a map, from any bird's eye view. It could only be understood from within it, from the level of the cobblestones themselves, one step at a time. The cobblestones, she had noticed them from the beginning, How could you not? But now, as she walked deeper into the neighborhood, she began to pay them a more particular attention. They were old, genuinely, evidently, irreducibly old. Not old in the way that some things are called old when they are merely dated or unfashionable, but old in the way that certain things carry the actual weight of time within them, that hold the past not as decoration, but as substance. Each stone was slightly different from its neighbors, different in size, in color, in the precise degree of its smoothness. Some were almost flat, worn to a near-perfect levelness by the uncountable passage of feet across them. Others had resisted the years more stubbornly and still held their original rough edges, so that walking over them required a small, constant adjustment of balance, a slight and pleasant attentiveness that kept you rooted in your body, in the immediate physical reality of where you were. They were the color of old pewter, mostly gray with undertones of blue and brown, darkened in the hollows between them where last night's rain had settled and not yet fully dried. In the morning light, they had a faint, soft sheen, not quite a gleam, but something close to it, the way old silver looks after it has been breathed on, not bright, not polished, but alive with a kind of interior light that brighter surfaces do not have. They made a sound beneath her shoes. This was something she had not expected, or not consciously expected, though perhaps some part of her had known, had anticipated it without language. The sound was low and soft, a gentle rhythmic contact between leather sole and old stone, a sound that was also, in some way she could not quite articulate, a feeling, a slight give in each step, the stone neither perfectly hard nor perfectly forgiving, but something in between, something that acknowledged the foot that walked upon it without giving way entirely. It was a sound that belonged to this place as completely as the smell of coffee or the color of the walls. It was the sound of Montmartre simply existing, receiving footsteps the way it had received footsteps for 150 years, without drama and without complaint. She walked, and the cobblestones spoke quietly beneath her, and she listened. The streets were narrow here, narrower than she had expected even from the photographs, narrower than seemed entirely practical by modern standards, which was perhaps why they were so beautiful. Practicality has a way of widening things, straightening things, smoothing things out, eliminating the beautiful accidents that occur when streets are built for people rather than for vehicles. These lanes had been built for people walking, for people carrying, for people going about the necessary and unremarkable business of daily life at a pace the body was designed for. Two people could pass each other comfortably if they were paying attention. Three would require a slight sideways shuffle, a small and neighborly negotiation of space. The buildings on either side rose close and tall, their upper floors leaning almost imperceptibly toward each other across the lane, as if they had been having a very slow conversation for the past century, and had gradually, without noticing, begun to incline toward each other the way people do when they are listening carefully. She looked up often. This was something the narrowness of the streets encouraged, that constant upward glance, the discovery of what existed above the level of the shops and doorways. Up there, the city was different, quieter, more private, shuttered windows with their paint in various states of gentle deterioration. Cream shutters gone the color of old bone, green shutters faded to the particular gray-green of lichen on stone. One pair painted a deep and unexpected cobalt blue that seemed to hold more color than the pale morning sky deserved. Chimneys at irregular intervals, some trailing the thinnest thread of smoke from an early morning fire. Ironwork balconies, narrow as afterthoughts, with pot plants on them, herbs mostly, and one brave geranium that had survived the winter and was beginning, tentatively, to consider flowering again. The occasional television aerial, anachronistic and somehow endearing. The occasional pigeon sitting on a ledge with the absolute and unquestioned authority of a creature that has decided this is its particular place in the world and sees no reason to be argued out of it. And the sky above all of it, pale, high, very slightly luminous. The clouds moving slowly from west to east in long, ragged shapes that caught the early light along their lower edges and held it there in thin lines of silver and the faintest imaginable rose. She walked for perhaps 20 minutes before she came to the first of the studios. She had known, in the abstract way one knows things one has read about, that Montmartre had a long history as a place where artists lived and worked, that the neighborhood had housed, at various points in its long and layered past, painters and writers and musicians drawn by the low rents and the particular quality of the light and the general atmosphere of a place that had not yet decided to take itself entirely seriously. She had known this the way she knew many historical facts, correctly, at a slight distance, as information rather than as feeling. But knowing and seeing are different things entirely. The studio was on the ground floor of a building halfway up a steep and slightly crooked lane. Its door was open, wide open, propped with a large, smooth stone that must have been collected for exactly this purpose. Through the doorway, she could see a space that was not quite orderly and not quite chaotic, but somewhere wonderfully between the two. The specific and functional disorder of a person deeply engaged in making something. Canvases everywhere, stacked against walls, propped on easels, leaning against chairs, and each other in careful, precarious arrangements. A table covered with tubes of paint and brushes in various states of use, rags of many colors, 3 glass jars holding murky water of different shades of murk. A wooden stool in the center of the room, facing an easel on which there was a painting in progress. She could see it only in part from the doorway. A sweep of blue and ochre, something that might have been sky or water or simply color, deciding what it wanted to be. The artist was not there, or not visible, but the room was so full of presence, so saturated with the evidence of ongoing work and thought and looking, that the absence of the person felt almost incidental. The work was there. The attention was there. She could feel it the way you can feel warmth from a fire, even after the fire has been allowed to die down. She did not linger at the doorway. It felt intrusive, too much like being caught looking through a window into someone's private life. She glanced for a few seconds, absorbing what she could, and then walked on. But she carried the image with her, those canvases, that stool, that particular quality of a space entirely given over to the act of seeing and making. And it stayed with her, warm and companionable, for the rest of the morning. There were other studios further up the lane. 2 of them had their shutters still closed, their inhabitants presumably still sleeping the deep and unscheduled sleep of people who answer to no alarm clock, but their own interior rhythm. One had a hand-lettered sign in the window, black ink on cream card, the letters slightly uneven, that said something in French she could not fully translate, but understood from context and instinct to be an invitation to enter and look. She did not enter. She was not ready yet for the deliberate act of stepping into something. She was still in the mode of passing through, of receiving, of letting things come to her rather than going to them. She was content to walk. She turned a corner and found herself in a small square. Not a grand square, not a formal one, not the kind that appears on tourist maps with a name and a monument and a recommended visiting time. Just a widening of the lane, an accidental space where 3 streets met at irregular angles, and the buildings drew back slightly to allow a little room for something other than passage. There was a tree in the center, or almost in the center, slightly off to one side in the way that trees in old city spaces often are, growing where they found soil rather than where a plan would have put them. It was a plain tree, old and wide, its new spring leaves just beginning to open, each one small and bright and very green, the particular green of things that have just arrived in the world and have not yet been dulled by summer heat or darkened by autumn. The light came through them in small, shifting pieces, moving across the stones of the square in a slow, gentle pattern that changed with every movement of the breeze. She stood beneath the tree for a while. She was not thinking about anything in particular. This was, she had learned over the years, a skill, the ability to not think about anything in particular, to simply be somewhere without narrating the experience to herself, without planning what to do next, without reaching for her phone to photograph the moment, and thereby, in some small but real way, remove herself from it. She had practiced this skill deliberately, with varying success. Some days it came easily. Other days the mind would not be stilled, would keep offering commentary and agenda, and the running list of things undone. But this morning, in this small accidental square, beneath this tree with its new and trembling leaves, the quiet came without effort. She simply stood. She let the light move across the stones. She breathed. An old man arrived in the square from the lane on the left, moving slowly and with the self-possessed unhurriedness of someone for whom slow walking is not a limitation, but a preference. He was wearing a dark coat and a flat cap, and he carried under one arm a folded newspaper, its edges slightly worn as if it had been picked up and put down several times already this morning. He made his way to the low stone step at the base of the building opposite and sat down on it with the careful deliberateness of someone who has sat in this exact spot many times before and knows precisely what it will feel like when they get there. He unfolded the newspaper. He read. Beside him on the step, placed with the casual precision of long habit, was a paper bag from the bakery. She could see the familiar logo, a small printed image too far away to make out clearly. And from the bag, he produced a croissant, or what remained of one. It was half-eaten, its torn end pale and layered and slightly glistening with butter. And he held it the way people hold food they are entirely comfortable with, without ceremony or self-consciousness, taking occasional unhurried bites while his eyes moved across the newsprint. He did not look up. He did not notice her, or if he did, he gave no indication of having noticed, which amounted, she thought, to the same thing, the privacy maintained, the moment undisturbed. She watched him for a few seconds, not intrusively, but with the quiet appreciation she felt for all the small, unconscious performances of daily life that play out in public spaces all over the world, unremarked and unrecorded. A man reading his newspaper in the morning, in his usual place, in his usual way, as he had probably done every day for 20 years. There was a completeness to it that moved her. She turned away and walked on. The lane rose more steeply now, and she felt it in her calves, a pleasant resistance, the physical reminder that she was climbing, that the ground beneath her had opinions about the direction of travel. She had always liked hills. There was something honest about them. They required something of you, asked you to engage the body, to commit a little more fully to the act of movement than flat ground demands. And the reward was always the same. The view that opens gradually as you climb, the city spreading itself out below you in slowly increasing increments. so that by the time you reach the top, you have the sense of having earned the panorama rather than simply arrived at it. But she was not at the top yet. She was somewhere in the middle, in the long and pleasant middle of the climb, and she was content to remain there. She passed a wall. This sounds like nothing. A wall is a wall, after all, and walls are among the least remarkable things a city contains. But this wall was not like other walls. It was long and old and whitewashed, or had been whitewashed at some point in the past that was sufficiently distant that the white had become many things cream and gray, and in places where the damp had worked its slow way through, a faint and ghostly green. And on this wall, someone, many someones probably, over many years had painted. Not graffiti in the ordinary sense, not the hurried territorial marks that appear on walls in most cities, but actual paintings. Small and large, careful and loose, some faded almost to nothing, and others still vivid, layered over each other in places, so that you could see through the edges of one image into the ghost of an older one beneath. There were flowers, there were faces, there were words in French and in other languages she did not recognize. There was a cat painted in broad, confident strokes of orange and black, its expression conveying the absolute self-sufficiency that only cats and certain philosophers manage to achieve. There was a view of Paris as seen from above, the Eiffel Tower sketched in a few economical lines, not a realistic rendering, but an impression, the idea of the tower rather than the tower itself, which somehow captured it more truly than any photograph. She walked slowly alongside the wall, reading it the way you read a letter that has been written by many hands at many different times. Not linearly, not with complete comprehension, but with a receptive and patient attention that allows meaning to accumulate rather than demanding it all at once. At the end of the wall, someone had painted something simple. 2 words in large and careful letters in English. Be here. She stopped. She read it twice, 3 times, not because it was difficult to understand. It was among the simplest things that had ever been said, but because it landed with a clarity and a precision that simple things sometimes have when they arrive at exactly the right moment. She had been here, she realized. She had been here all morning, more fully than she was used to being anywhere. The cobblestones, and the man with his newspaper, and the half-eaten croissant, and the tree with its new leaves, and the studios with their open doors, and the smell of bread, and the pigeons, and the light. She had been present for all of it, genuinely and quietly present, in the way she had been trying for a long time to be present for her own life. She felt something close to gratitude. She walked on. A cat appeared. It appeared the way cats in Montmartre apparently appeared from nowhere, without warning or preamble. with the air of having always been there, and simply having chosen, just now, to make itself known. It was a tabby, its coat a warm mixture of brown and gray and amber, its markings the intricate, slightly random stripes of the domestic short hair that has never needed to be bred for anything other than its own contentment. It was sitting on a windowsill. The ledge was perhaps 2 feet above street level, part of the ground floor of the building to her left. A window whose glass was slightly rippled with age in the way that very old glass sometimes is, as if the years have taught it a small flexibility. The cat watched her. Its eyes were the color of pale honey, with the long vertical pupils that in bright light would narrow to a fine dark line. But in this softer morning, illumination had opened to an easy, comfortable oval. It watched her with an expression that contained, in roughly equal measure, interest and absolute indifference. The paradox that is somehow the defining characteristic of the species. She met its gaze. This was something she had learned about cats, that they responded, not always, but often, to being looked at directly, and without either threat or excessive eagerness, to being regarded simply, the way one being regards another when there is nothing to be gained or lost from the encounter. She stopped walking. She looked at the cat. The cat looked at her. For perhaps 10 seconds, nothing happened. The lane was quiet. The morning held still. And then the cat did the thing that cats do when they have decided, for reasons entirely their own, that a person is acceptable. It blinked. A slow, deliberate, complete blink. Both eyes closing and opening in a movement so unhurried, it seemed almost contemplative. A blink that contained within itself the entire philosophy of an animal that has never once in its life been in a hurry. She blinked back. The cat looked away, with a turn of the head so fluid and unhurried it might have been a sigh, and directed its attention to something in the middle distance that she could not see and probably did not exist. The audience was over. She had been assessed, found acceptable, and released. She smiled. She walked on, smiling, the smile staying with her longer than smiles usually do, lasting around the next corner and into the next lane, where the cobblestones were slightly wider and the buildings slightly further apart, and a pair of sparrows were conducting a rapid, spirited argument in a bush at the base of a wall, their voices small and emphatic and full of the particular urgency that small creatures bring to all their transactions. Everything here, she thought, moves at the pace of a soft exhale. She had not planned to think this. It arrived on its own, the way the best thoughts do, without effort or intention, from some quiet place in the mind that has been paying attention, while the louder parts of consciousness were occupied with other things. And it was true. She felt it as true in the way you feel a true thing, not just in the mind, but in the body, in the slow steadiness of her breathing, in the ease of her shoulders, in the particular quality of her attention, which had become, over the course of this morning's walking, both more alert and more relaxed than it usually was. Alert in the way of a person who is genuinely curious about what they are seeing. Relaxed in the way of a person who has, for the moment at least, stopped needing things to be different from what they are. She did not rush. She had known, coming here, that she would not rush. But knowing you will not rush is different from the actual experience of not rushing. The felt reality of a body moving at its own natural pace, following its own inclinations, stopping when it wants to stop, and walking on when it is ready, accountable to nothing, and no one but the morning and the lane and its own quiet curiosity. She let the lane decide where it wanted to take her. This was the thing she had been practicing in various ways and with varying success for a large part of her adult life. The art of letting things unfold without forcing them, of trusting the world to offer what it has to offer if you are willing to move through it at a pace slow enough to receive the offering. Paris seemed to understand this. Montmartre seemed to have been built for it. The lanes did not go straight because they had not been designed to go straight. They went where the hill allowed them to go, where the old property lines permitted, where the accumulated decisions of generations of builders and walkers and dwellers had sent them. Each turning arrived at through the specific historical accident of this being the way that happened to work, that happened to lead somewhere, that happened to be where the lane was when the lane was being made. She turned a corner she had not planned to turn. She found herself in a lane she had not known existed. She walked along it slowly, with her hands loose at her sides, and her face open to whatever the morning had decided to place in front of her next. The cobblestones continued their quiet conversation with her shoes. The walls leaned their faded, beautiful faces toward each other across the narrow air. The morning held, and she walked through it, unhurried, present, entirely and simply here. The way she had always wanted to walk through the days of her life, and had not always managed, but was managing now, on this particular Tuesday in April, on these particular cobblestones, in this particular neighborhood of this particular ancient and unhurrying city. She walked. The lane went on ahead of her, winding slightly, rising gently, full of a quietness that was not emptiness, but the opposite of emptiness, a fullness, a richness, the specific and irreplaceable texture of a place that has been lived in for a very long time by people who loved it, and has absorbed that love into its stones and its walls and its uneven and beautiful and endlessly patient cobblestones. She walked on. She was not yet ready to stop. She might not be ready for a long time. And that, she thought, with a quietness that felt like the most natural thing in the world. That was perfectly, completely, entirely all right. Let the lane hold you now. Let the cobblestones carry you gently toward sleep. Crescent moon, the cafe with the blue chairs. She found it by accident. She was beginning to understand, the only proper way to find anything in Montmartre. You did not search for things here, not in the deliberate, purposeful way of someone with a list and a limited amount of time. You walked, and you let your attention move freely, and things found you when they were ready to be found, arriving in your line of sight with the quiet, unhurried certainty of something that had always been there and had simply been waiting for you to slow down enough to notice it. The cafe was on a corner, not a prominent corner, not the kind that commands attention, that presents itself boldly to the street with its best face forward. This was a modest corner where a lane she had been following uphill met another lane coming in from the left at a slightly odd angle. The way streets in old neighborhoods sometimes meet, as if they had been laid down by people who were not consulting the same plan. The building that occupied the corner was narrow and old, its ground floor given over to the cafe, its upper floors hidden behind shutters still closed against the morning. Pale green shutters, their paint gone soft and slightly chalky with age, the kind of color that was not chosen so much as arrived at through the slow collaboration of original pigment and long time. The chairs were blue. This was the first thing she saw. Not the cafe itself, not the sign above the door, not the striped awning that extended over the two small tables placed outside on the pavement, but the chairs. They were a faded cornflower blue, the specific blue of something that had once been brighter and more certain of itself, and had softened over the years into something more interesting. A blue that had seen enough seasons to have become, in its fading, not less blue, but more fully and honestly blue. The way certain people become more fully themselves as they age, the unnecessary parts worn away, until what remains is the essential thing. There were 4 of them, 2 at each of the small tables, and they sat on the uneven cobblestones at very slightly different angles, the way chairs on cobblestones always do. None of them quite level, all of them entirely comfortable with this. The tables were small, small in the serious, committed way of French cafe tables. Tables that have no interest in accommodating more than is strictly necessary, that offer just enough surface for a cup and a hand, and perhaps a small plate. And consider this sufficient, because it is sufficient, because the point of sitting at a cafe table in Paris has never been the table. She stopped walking. She stood at the corner and looked at the chairs for a moment. Something in her simply settled. It was not a dramatic sensation, not a sudden rush of feeling, or a sharp intake of breath, or any of the more legible expressions of emotion that are easier to describe and easier to recognize. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of something slotting softly into place, the way the last piece of a puzzle sometimes does, not with a click, but with a sigh, a slight release of tension you had not realized you were holding. She looked at the blue chairs and the small tables and the striped awning, and she thought, without deliberation, without analysis, "This is where I am going to sit." She sat. She chose the chair that faced the lane she had come from, the lane that rose back downhill between its close-set buildings, its cobblestones still faintly wet and gleaming in the morning light. She positioned herself so that she could see both up and down the lane, which meant she was sitting slightly sideways at the table, her body turned a little toward the street rather than squared against it, which felt right. It felt like the posture of someone who has arrived somewhere and is not quite ready to stop looking at the world that brought them there. The table was barely wider than her two hands, placed side by side. She placed her hands on it anyway, flat and open, and felt the slight roughness of the metal surface under her palms. It was a zinc table, or something like zinc, cool and slightly textured, with the faint circular ghost of many previous cups pressed into its surface, like a gentle, accidental record of all the mornings that had happened here before this one. She liked this. She liked the evidence of previous presence, the accumulated invisible history of the table, all the hands that had rested on it, and all the cups that had warmed those hands, and all the eyes that had looked out from this corner, at this lane, at this particular angle of light. The waiter came out almost immediately. He was young, mid-20s, perhaps, with dark hair and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and an apron tied loosely around his waist. He had the easy, slightly distracted manner of someone who has done this job long enough to do it well without needing to concentrate on it, which left his concentration free for other things. She could not tell what those other things were, but she had the impression of a person whose mind was pleasantly elsewhere, while his hands and his professional courtesy operated smoothly and without requiring his full attention. He said something in French. Her French caught up a moment later. He was asking what she would like. She ordered a café au lait because she always ordered café au lait in the morning, because it was the correct thing, the only thing, the thing that made complete sense at this hour in this place. And then, because she saw it written on the small chalkboard leaning against the wall beside the door, the handwriting slightly hurried, the chalk a little thick in places. She added a slice of tart au citron. He nodded without writing anything down. He went inside. She settled more completely into the chair. It was the kind of settling that happens gradually, in stages. First, the physical settling, the body finding its position, the spine softening slightly, the shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch from where tension had been holding them without her noticing. Then the mental settling, the mind releasing its grip on the next thing, letting go of whatever forward lean it had been maintaining out of habit. The habit of always being slightly ahead of the present moment, always already thinking about what comes next. And then, last and most complete, the settling that has no particular name, the settling of the whole person into the whole moment, the arrival that is not just physical, but total, the sense of being not just in a place, but of it, part of it, woven into the texture of this particular corner, of this particular morning. She looked at the lane. A pigeon landed on the cobblestones, perhaps 10 feet away. It was a city pigeon, the ordinary urban kind, gray and iridescent and slightly fat, with the bow-legged, rolling walk that pigeons have, as if the ground is always slightly unstable, and they have simply decided to make peace with this. It walked in a small, purposeful circle, head dipping with each step in that characteristic motion, searching the cobblestones with the focused optimism of a creature that has learned to find things in places where other creatures would not think to look. It found something, she could not see what, and dealt with it quickly and with great efficiency. Then it walked another circle, slightly larger, conducting the same investigation of a new area with the same focused optimism. She watched it with great affection. She had always found pigeons more interesting than their reputation suggested. They were, she thought, underrated philosophers of urban life, creatures that had made a complete and apparently satisfying peace with the world as they found it, that had looked at the city and decided, without complaint or nostalgia, that this was where they lived now, and that the city contained, for those who knew how to look, everything a life required. There was a lesson in this. She was not entirely sure what the lesson was, but she was fairly sure it was a good one. The waiter reappeared. He placed the café au lait on the table with the practiced ease of someone who has placed 10,000 cups on 10,000 tables and has developed, through this repetition, a relationship with the act of placing cups that most people will never achieve with anything. The cup was wide and shallow. The coffee, a warm, milky brown, steam rising from it in a thin and wavering thread that caught the morning light for a moment and then dissolved into the cool air. Beside it, he placed the tart au citron on a small white plate. A neat wedge, its surface glazed to a faint shine, the lemon curd filling the precise pale yellow of old ivory, the pastry beneath it thin and even and just barely golden. He disappeared back inside without ceremony. She did not reach for the cup immediately. She let it sit. She let the steam rise. She looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something beautiful before you touch it, not prolonging the moment artificially, not making a performance of appreciation, but simply allowing a second or two for the full reality of the thing to arrive before the act of consuming. It changed the nature of the encounter. A cup of coffee in Paris on a Tuesday morning in April, steam rising, the lane beyond it still gleaming with last night's rain, the blue chairs and the small zinc table and the striped awning overhead making a kind of frame for the moment. Then she picked it up. She wrapped both hands around it. The cup was warm, properly warm, the heat of it moving through her palms and into her fingers in the way that warmth from a cup does, which is different from the warmth of any other object, more personal somehow, more directly comforting. She held it without drinking for a moment, just feeling the warmth. Then she drank. It was very good. Not spectacular, not the kind of coffee that demands attention and commentary, and the specific vocabulary of people who have thought a great deal about coffee. Just very good, honest and warm, and exactly right for the morning, with the slight bitterness of the espresso softened, but not overwhelmed by the milk, so that each sip delivered both things at once. The gentle shock of the coffee and the comfort of the milk, the wake and the soothe together, the two in easy, unargumentative balance. She set the cup down. She looked at the lane. 2 elderly women had appeared from the direction of the upper lane and were making their way down the cobblestones with the unhurried confidence of people entirely at home in their surroundings. They were talking low, continuous French, the kind of conversation that was clearly not about anything urgent or remarkable, but about the ongoing texture of daily life, the particular and inexhaustible subject that people who have known each other for a long time never tire of, because it is not really about what is being said, but about the simple, continued pleasure of saying things to each other, of maintaining the thread that runs between two people who have been part of each other's days for a very long time. One was wearing a coat the color of dark plum. The other had a scarf the color of autumn leaves. They walked close together, not quite touching, but nearly, with the physical ease of people who have long ago stopped needing to negotiate the space between them. Their voices were low and companionable, and she could catch only fragments, a name, a word she recognized, the rising inflection of a question. But the fragments were enough. The music of the conversation reached her clearly even if the words did not. And the music was warm and unhurried, and full of the particular comfort of long familiarity. They passed the cafe without looking at her. She watched them go, the plum coat and the autumn scarf moving down the lane together, their voices continuing as they turned the corner and were gone, leaving behind them only the faint imprint of their passing. The lane slightly more inhabited than it had been, the morning slightly warmer for there, having moved through it. She picked up her cup again. A bicycle appeared at the top of the lane. It came down slowly. Its rider, a young man in a dark jacket, a canvas bag over one shoulder, navigating the cobblestones with the careful, slightly stiff posture of someone who has done this before, but still respects the potential for the cobblestones to make things difficult if not treated with appropriate attention. The bicycle was old and black and slightly large for him, and in the basket mounted on the front there was a quantity of bread, 2 long baguettes, a paper bag, something wrapped in a cloth, arranged with the casual abundance of a still life painting, as if they had been placed there for exactly this visual effect, rather than for the merely practical purpose of being transported from one place to another. He passed without looking up, his attention on the cobblestones, and the task of navigating them at a speed slow enough to be safe and fast enough to be dignified. The bread in the basket shifted slightly as he went over a rougher section of the lane, the baguettes leaning together for a moment and then settling back. She watched until he had rounded the corner at the bottom and disappeared, and then she sat for a moment with the image of him, the black bicycle and the canvas bag and the bread and the cobblestones, held lightly in her mind like a postcard of a life she was glimpsing from the outside and finding beautiful precisely because of its ordinariness. She reached for the tarte au citron. The pastry was thin and very crisp, the kind of crispness that yields with a clean, delicate break rather than a crumble, the kind that speaks of butter used without apology and heat applied with precision. The lemon filling was cold and sharp, and sweet in the way that lemon things are sweet, not sugary, but rounded, the sweetness and the acidity so closely balanced that they enhanced rather than canceled each other, each mouthful leaving behind a clean brightness on the palate that made the next sip of coffee taste better, and the next bite of tart taste better still. The two things in a simple and excellent conversation. She ate slowly. She looked at the lane. The morning was fully established now. Not early anymore, not that first tentative version of morning that belongs only to the very beginning of the day, but mid-morning, confident and warm, the light more golden now and the shadows shorter, the city around her more awake, more in motion, more fully itself. She could hear, from somewhere she could not see, the sound of a shop shutter being raised, that metallic, rolling sound, slightly harsh, followed by the quieter sounds of a door opening and the first movements of commerce beginning. She could hear voices from an open window above the lane, a domestic conversation, the words indistinct the tone easy and unremarkable, the sound of an ordinary morning in an ordinary apartment above an ordinary lane, which was to say, in the context of this place and this morning, the sound of something entirely extraordinary. She finished the tart. She finished the coffee. She did not immediately reach for anything. She did not look at her phone. She did not make a plan for what came next, or think about where she might go, or consider the time, or do any of the things she might have done at home. When sitting still for too long began to feel like something that needed to be justified, when the impulse to be doing or going or producing something began to reassert itself with its habitual insistence, she simply sat. Her hands rested on the cool zinc table, loose and open. Her eyes moved slowly over the lane, the cobblestones and the walls and the window boxes, and the faint shine of last night's rain still lingering in the lower corners where the light had not yet reached. A cat crossed the lane at the far end, a black cat, quick and purposeful. There, and then gone before she had properly registered it. A child's voice came from somewhere above, a single syllable, bright and high, and then laughter, a grown-up's laughter following it, warm and involuntary. There was no urgency here. She felt this not as a thought, but as a physical reality, as something her body understood independently of her mind. The absence of urgency, the complete and unambiguous absence of the forward pull that usually inhabited her days, that constant low-level tension of having somewhere to be or something to do or some version of herself to maintain or achieve. None of that was here. None of that had any purchase on this morning, this corner, this table, these hands resting open on this cool surface. There was only now this cup, this light, this lane, this cool April air that smelled of coffee and old stone, and the faint, sweet ghost of someone's bread being toasted somewhere nearby, in some kitchen behind some closed window, in some life she would never see, but could imagine easily: a warm kitchen, a small table, a window looking out over the rooftops, a cup of something, the morning. She felt her shoulders soften. This happened gradually, in the way that real softening happens, not all at once, not as the result of any deliberate effort, but as the slow consequence of sustained ease, of being allowed to simply be somewhere without requirement or expectation. First, one shoulder, dropping almost imperceptibly from the position it had held, probably for weeks, of being very slightly raised, very slightly braced, the posture of a person who is used to being ready for something, and then the other shoulder following, the symmetry reasserting itself at a lower and more natural level, and then the whole upper body, the spine finding a new arrangement, easier and more honest than the one it had been maintaining, the chest opening slightly, the breathing deepening without being asked to, like pages turning in a quiet book. She sat with this thought for a moment, the image of it, the feeling it named, the particular quality of ease that comes not from the absence of anything difficult, but from the temporary and complete suspension of the need to manage difficulty, the rare and precious experience of a moment that asks nothing of you and offers, in exchange for this asking nothing, everything. She did not want to leave. She knew she would leave. The morning was still there. The city was still outside the lane. There were cobblestones yet to be walked and lanes yet to be turned into, and things yet to be seen that she could not yet imagine. She would leave, but not yet, not for another few minutes, not until she had sat a little longer with this cup and this light and this unhurried spring air and the blue chairs and the zinc table and the pigeon that had returned and was once again conducting its optimistic investigation of the cobblestones in the immediate vicinity. She looked at the pigeon. The pigeon looked at her. She looked at the lane. The lane looked back, in the way that lanes in Montmartre look back, with patience, with a certain gentle amusement, with the settled knowledge of a place that has seen many people sit at this corner and look at it in exactly this way, and has found, over the long years, that it does not mind being looked at, that it rather likes it, in fact, that being seen, really seen, with attention and without agenda, is a kind of gift that places as much as people are grateful to receive. She breathed in, she breathed out. She was, she thought, or did not quite think, but felt, in the wordless way of things that are simply true. She was more here, right now, than she had been in a very long time. More present, more awake to the specific and irreplaceable texture of this particular moment, on this particular morning, in this particular city. The waiter reappeared briefly in the doorway, glanced at her table, saw that nothing was needed, and went back inside. A cloud moved across the sun. The light in the lane shifted, softened slightly, the shadows losing their edges, the cobblestones turning from pewter silver to a warmer, more uniform gray. Then the cloud moved on, and the light returned, and the lane was itself again, bright and particular and entirely, specifically real. She sat for a little while longer. Then slowly, she reached into the small bag she had brought and found a few coins and placed them on the table. A little more than the cost, because the morning had been generous, and she wanted to be generous in return, not in any grand way, but in the small, quiet way of someone who understands that kindness is mostly made of small things. She stood. She pushed the blue chair back gently on the cobblestones. It made a soft, scraping sound, low and brief, and picked up her bag and turned toward the lane. The lane rose ahead of her, winding slightly, the cobblestones patient and familiar now, almost like old friends after the morning's walking. She took one look back at the cafe, the blue chairs, the small tables, the striped awning, the window with its faint rippled glass, and held the image for a moment, not photographing it, not trying to fix it or keep it, just looking, just being in the presence of it for one last quiet second. Then she turned and walked on into the morning, into the lane, into whatever the city had decided in its unhurried and generous way to offer her next. Rest now. Let the warmth of the cup stay with you. Let the blue chairs hold you gently as you drift toward sleep. Crescent moon, the garden above the city. She found the steps by following the light. This was not something she could have explained rationally. Not in the way that directions are explained, with street names and landmarks and the precise language of navigation. It was more instinctive than that, more bodily. The way certain decisions are made not by the thinking mind, but by something older and quieter that lives beneath the thinking mind. Something that knows, without being told, which way to turn when you reach a corner, which path to take when two paths diverge, which direction holds what you are, without knowing it, looking for. The light had been shifting all morning. She had noticed this, the way it moved through the lanes of Montmartre, not as a single, uniform thing, but as something layered and variable, catching the pale stone walls of one building and leaving the building beside it in a soft, bluish shadow, pooling in the lower corners of the cobblestoned squares and stretching in long, thin lines across the upper faces of the houses. She had been following it loosely, unconsciously, the way you follow music heard from a distance, not with purpose exactly, but with a kind of willing orientation toward the source, a readiness to let it lead. And now the light was above her. It was coming from the top of the hill, from somewhere beyond the roofline, beyond the last row of pale buildings and their closed morning shutters, from some open space that she could not yet see, but could feel the presence of in the way the air changed as she began to climb. The air at the bottom of the lane was close and shaded, carrying the cool, slightly damp character of narrow streets that the sun reaches only briefly and at a steep angle. But as she climbed, as the lane rose more steeply beneath her feet, and the buildings on either side began to thin, to space themselves more generously, to give back a little of the sky they had been holding between their rooftops, the air changed. It opened. It became warmer, lighter, carrying something green and faintly sweet that was the smell of open ground, of earth and grass, and the particular cleanness of a place where the wind could move freely. She climbed toward it. The steps arrived without announcement. One moment, she was on the cobblestoned lane. The next, the lane had become steps. Long, broad, shallow steps of the same pale gray stone as everything else, worn at their centers into a gentle concavity, by the passage of centuries of feet, so that each step held a soft hollow, a bowl of stone shaped by the accumulated weight of all the people who had climbed here before her. She placed her feet in these hollows as she climbed and thought about all those other feet, the feet of painters and poets and ordinary people and tourists and residents and lovers and solitary walkers, all of them climbing this same hill in all the different weathers and all the different moods that a century and a half of mornings contains. All of them feeling this same slight burn in the calves, this same gradual opening of the view, this same quiet and building anticipation of the top. She climbed slowly. She was not in a hurry. She was never in a hurry this morning. The morning had cured her of hurry the way certain mornings do, the way a very still and beautiful thing, once properly seen, makes the idea of rushing past anything else seem briefly absurd. She placed each foot with care, feeling the worn stone through the soles of her shoes, letting her breathing deepen and slow into the rhythm of the climb, arms loose at her sides, face lifted slightly toward the sky. The city spread itself below her as she climbed. This was the gift of steps on a hill, the view that arrived not all at once, but incrementally, each new step adding a little more of the world to what you could see, so that the panorama assembled itself gradually, piece by piece, like a painting being uncovered from beneath a cloth, revealing itself not as a completed image, but as a process, the process of becoming visible. She paused twice on the way up, not because she was tired, but because the view, at certain moments, demanded pausing. It demanded a stillness of its own, a stopping of the body's forward motion, so that the eyes could do their work properly, could take in the full scale of what was being offered. Paris. She had seen photographs of Paris from above. Everyone had. She had seen the aerial images, the drone footage, the views from the top of the tower. The city spread out in all directions in that famous, recognizable pattern of gray rooftops and green parks, and the silver thread of the river winding through it all. She had seen these images so many times that she thought she knew what Paris looked like from above. She had not known. Photographs do not capture scale, and they do not capture atmosphere, and they do not capture the particular quality of light on a pale stone city on an April morning after rain. The Paris she saw from these steps was not the Paris of the photographs. It was softer, more continuous, more alive in its immensity. Not the sharp, clear-edged city of high-resolution aerial images, but something more like a painting done in washes, in the palest grays and silvers and the faintest blues, the rooftops merging into each other in the middle distance, the streets becoming invisible at a certain remove, and leaving only the broad shapes of blocks and quarters, the green of the parks and the gardens scattered through it all like the memory of the countryside the city had been built upon, and above all of it the sky pale and high and luminous, clouds slow and enormous, their shadows moving across the city's surface in gradual, stately sweeps that turned whole neighborhoods from silver to gray and back again in the space of a minute. She stood on the steps and looked at it for a long time. She did not take a photograph. This was a decision she made consciously, standing there. A deliberate choice not to reach for her phone, not to mediate the experience through a lens, not to make of this moment something that could be stored and shared and shown to others. She wanted to keep it entirely for herself. She wanted it to live nowhere but inside her, in the particular and unrepeatable archive of things she had seen with her own eyes and felt with her own body, and would carry forward not as an image but as a memory, which is a different thing, a living thing, something that changes and deepens with time rather than remaining fixed at the moment of its capture. She looked until she had really looked. Then she turned and climbed the last of the steps to the top. The basilica was there, Sacré-Cœur, white and domed against the pale sky, its stone the color of old bone, its familiar silhouette more real and more strange in person than she had expected, the way famous things often are. It was larger than the photographs suggested, and more present, not in any aggressive or imposing way, but simply there, undeniably, completely there, occupying its space on the hill with the complete and unhurried solidity of something that has been in one place for a very long time and has stopped needing to explain itself. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned away from it. Not dismissively. It was beautiful, and she was glad of it, glad it existed, glad she had seen it. But she had not climbed the hill to see the basilica. She had climbed for something she had not yet found and could not quite name, something the light had been pointing her toward all morning with its patient, wordless insistence. She found it almost immediately. It was to the side of the basilica, to the right, tucked between the curve of the building's outer wall and a low stone boundary that separated the open esplanade from a space she had not noticed at first glance, because it was slightly lower than the level she was standing on and partly screened by a row of young hornbeam trees, their branches still bare of full leaf, but clouded with the green haze of new buds, each one no bigger than the nail of her smallest finger, and each one the most vivid, most concentrated green she had ever seen. A garden. She went down the few steps that led to it and stopped at the entrance and simply looked. It was not a grand garden. It was not the kind of garden that appears in guidebooks or on lists of things to see in Paris. Not a garden of design or spectacle or horticultural ambition. It was a garden that had settled into itself over a long time and become, through this settling, something more interesting than anything it could have been if it had been planned. A garden of irregularity and accommodation plants that had been placed and then left to their own decisions. Paths that had become paths because people had walked them rather than because anyone had laid them. A bench that occupied its particular position, not because a designer had determined that a bench should go there, but because someone at some point had placed it there, and it had proved itself right, and there it had stayed. The rose bushes were not yet fully in bloom. This was the first thing she noticed, their not yetness, the particular state of suspension they occupied, partway between the bare-stemmed austerity of winter and the full, extravagant openness of summer. The stems were dark and thorned, new growth running along them in thin red shoots, and at the tips of many of these shoots there were buds, the rose buds of early spring, tightly closed, pointed, their outer petals wrapped around everything that was inside them with a closeness that seemed almost protective, as if the flower understood that it was not yet time and was content to wait, to hold its beauty inward a little longer, to keep it secret for a few more days. She walked toward them. She crouched down beside one of the bushes, a low, slightly sprawling thing near the edge of the path, its branches reaching in 3 different directions with the casual ambition of something that has never been told to stay within its allotted space, and looked at one of the buds closely. It was the size of the last joint of her thumb, deep red at its base, where the sepals curved back, shading to a pink so pale it was almost white at the very tip. The outer petals were smooth and very slightly waxy, catching the morning light and holding it in a faint, cool sheen. She did not touch it. She just looked, the way you look at something so precisely itself, so entirely and completely what it is, that looking at it becomes a kind of conversation, a quiet exchange between the thing seen and the person seeing. She straightened up and walked further into the garden. The cherry tree was at the far end. She had not seen it from the entrance. It was around a slight curve in the path, hidden by the hornbeam hedge, and a tall stone wall against which an old climbing rose, not yet in bud, had been trained in the careful, fan-shaped pattern of a plant that has been persuaded over many years to grow according to someone else's geometry, while managing, somehow, to remain entirely itself. The tree revealed itself gradually as she walked, first the upper branches, visible above the hedge, and then, as she came around the curve, the whole tree, standing in a small open space at the path's end, with the settled, self-possessed air of something that has grown in one place for a very long time and is entirely at home there. It was not a large tree, but it was a beautiful one, the trunk pale gray and slightly twisted, not dramatically, but with the gentle, almost imperceptible spiral that old cherry trees sometimes develop, as if the years have put a slow, soft rotation into the wood. The branches spread from the trunk in an arrangement that was neither symmetrical nor random, but something between the two, something that had its own internal logic, the logic of growth responding to light and wind and space over decades. And from every branch, from every twig, from every smallest terminal shoot, there were blossoms. Or rather, there had been blossoms. They were falling. This was what she had come to, though she had not known it until she saw it. The cherry blossoms in the act of falling. The tree in that brief and specific moment between full bloom and bare branch, when the flowers release themselves and the air beneath the tree becomes, for a few days, a kind of slow and continuous snowfall of petals, each one small and pale and five-pointed, drifting down through the cool spring air with the unhurried certainty of something that has completed its purpose and is at peace with the completion. She stood beneath the tree. She looked up. Above her, the branches made a loose and intricate tracery against the pale sky. And from every part of this tracery, petals were detaching themselves, one or two at a time, drifting free with each movement of the breeze, spinning very slowly as they fell, each one following its own slightly different path through the air, some falling almost straight down, some carried sideways in a long, looping curve, some catching an upward eddy and rising briefly before descending, all of them eventually arriving at the same destination. The ground, the path, the bench, her upturned face, her hands, her shoulders, the surface of the world. She stood with her face lifted and her eyes open, and the petals fell around her. The bench was just behind her, old wood, its surface worn smooth, its color the silver gray of outdoor wood that has lived through many winters. She sat down on it slowly, without taking her eyes from the tree. The wood was cool through her jacket. She placed her hands on her knees, palms up, and petals fell into them. One, then another, then a small cluster of three that arrived together, light as breath. She looked at them. They were the palest possible pink, almost white, the pink barely there, the color of the inside of a seashell, or the sky at the very last moment before full darkness on a clear winter evening. Each petal was slightly translucent, the light coming through them faintly, so that they seemed to glow from within, to carry their own soft luminosity. The edges were irregular, slightly frilled, each petal unique in the way that handmade things are unique. The same in all the ways that matter, different in all the ways that make them themselves. A particular kind of peace. She had thought about peace before, had thought about it the way you think about something you want and do not quite have, the way you think about something you have read about and understood intellectually, but not yet felt fully in the body. She had tried to find it in various ways and various places, with varying success. The way people try things, meditation and long walks and quiet rooms and the right books at the right moment. She had found pieces of it. she had found versions of it, but she had not, until this moment, sitting on this bench beneath this cherry tree, with petals falling into her open hands, found it like this complete, this total, this utterly uncomplicated. There is a particular kind of peace that comes only when you have nowhere left to be. She felt this not as a thought, but as a fact, a physical fact, a fact of the body as much as the mind, as undeniable and as simple as the weight of the bench beneath her or the coolness of the air on her face. She had nowhere to be, not in the trivial sense of having no appointment, no schedule, no obligation. She had known that all morning, but in a deeper sense, a more complete sense. She had nowhere to be in the way that means there is no other version of this moment you are supposed to be living. There is no better use of this particular hour. There is no improvement to be made on the specific and irreplaceable reality of sitting here, now, with petals falling, in this garden, in this city, in this spring morning that will never come again. She was here. She was entirely and only here. A petal landed on her cheek. She felt it impossibly light, the lightest possible touch, the touch of something that weighs almost nothing, and is almost nothing and is, precisely because of this, more delicate and more real than most things she had touched in a long time. She did not brush it away. She let it stay until the breeze, shifting slightly, lifted it again and carried it onward across her shoulder and away. The garden was quiet around her. Not silent, there were sounds, but they were the sounds of quietness rather than the sounds of noise. The very soft sigh of the breeze through the branches, the occasional small rustle of a bird moving in the hornbeam hedge, the distant and intermittent sounds of the city below, reduced by distance to a gentle, undifferentiated murmur, like the sound of a river heard from a great distance, present but uninsistent, a reminder that the world continued without requiring her participation. She breathed. She was aware of her breathing in the way you become aware of it only when it has become entirely natural. Not the self-conscious breathing of someone trying to breathe correctly or deeply, or in some prescribed therapeutic way, but the simple, unstudied breathing of a body completely at ease, the lungs doing their ancient and necessary work without supervision, the breath moving in and out in long, slow waves, each one slightly longer than the last. Time passed. She did not know how much. She had stopped consulting time that morning in the way that you stop consulting a clock when you are somewhere that makes clock time feel irrelevant. Not because time has stopped, but because the quality of the time has changed, has become something different from the measured, parceled out time of ordinary days, has become instead something more like the time of sleep or of deep attention, time that is felt rather than counted, time that moves according to its own internal rhythm rather than the rhythm imposed on it by numbers. The petals fell, She watched them. At some point, she could not have said exactly when she became aware that she was completely and entirely still. Not still in the effortful way of someone trying to be still, trying to hold the body quiet against its inclination to move, but still in the effortless way, the way of a body that has simply and without drama arrived at its own natural resting state. Her hands lay open on her knees, the petals in them warming slightly with the warmth of her palms. Her spine was straight without being rigid, the way a spine is straight when the muscles supporting it are neither tense nor slack, but simply working quietly as they were designed to. Her face was calm. She could feel this, the absence of the small habitual tensions that usually lived in the muscles around her eyes and jaw, the absence of the expressions that faces make when the person behind them is engaged in the constant low-level work of navigating the world. She was not navigating anything. She was simply here. A sparrow landed on the path a few feet in front of the bench. It was a house sparrow, small and brown and precise, with the bright, rapid attention that small birds have. Nothing slow about them, nothing languid, every movement quick and certain, every glance sharp and complete. It hopped twice along the path, stopped, turned its head to look at her with one dark eye, hopped again, found something invisible to her in the gravel of the path, and dealt with it swiftly, then flew off in a low, straight line toward the hornbeam hedge and was gone. She smiled. She had been smiling. She realized for some time, not broadly, not in the demonstrative way of someone performing happiness, but in the quiet, almost involuntary way of someone who is experiencing something good, and whose face, without being asked to do anything, has simply arranged itself to reflect this. The city waited below. She could feel it there, patient, unhurried, full of lanes not yet walked, and corners not yet turned, and mornings not yet received. It was not going anywhere. It had no interest in hurrying her. It had been here for centuries, and would be here long after this particular April morning had become part of the deep, unrecorded history of all the mornings that had ever happened in this place. And it understood, in the way that old cities understand things, that the best thing it could offer anyone who came to it was exactly this: the permission to stop, to sit, to let the petals fall, to need nothing more than what was already completely here. She sat for a long while. The cherry tree shed its blossoms with a patience that was beyond patience, the patience of something that does not experience time as waiting, that simply is what it is at each moment, without reference to what it was before or what it will become after. The petals fell and fell and fell, each one making its own particular journey from the branch to the ground, each one different, each one the same. She watched them. She was in no hurry. She had nowhere left to be, Not here, in this garden, on this bench, beneath this tree. She was, for perhaps the first time in a long time, exactly where she was supposed to be, in the only moment that existed, the only moment that had ever existed, the present moment in all its simplicity and all its completeness and all its quiet, inexhaustible beauty. The petals fell. She breathed. The city waited, patient and full of grace below. Rest now. Let the petals fall around you. Let the garden hold you softly as sleep comes to find you. Crescent moon, an afternoon of slow wandering. She did not notice when the morning became afternoon. This was how it happened, not with any announcement, not with the sharp transition that clocks and schedules impose on the day when you are living by them, but gradually, softly, the way one piece of music resolves into another in the hands of a conductor who understands that the spaces between things are as important as the things themselves. The light simply changed. It warmed. The shadows shifted their angles and shortened their lengths, and the air, which had been carrying the cool, slightly damp character of early April morning, became something else, fuller, more golden, more willing to settle on the skin with the faint, tentative warmth of a season that has decided, not quite definitively, but with growing confidence, that it intends to stay. She had been sitting beneath the cherry tree for a long time. She knew this without knowing exactly how long, felt it in the pleasant stiffness of her legs when she finally stood, in the way the light had moved from one side of the garden to the other while she sat, in the changed temperature of the bench beneath her palms when she pressed them down to help herself up. A long time, long enough for the morning's urgency, what little urgency the morning had contained, which was very little, to have entirely dissolved, long enough for the particular quality of stillness she had found on that bench to have settled not just into her mind, but into her body, into the way she held herself, the way she breathed, the way her eyes moved when she looked at things. She stood. She stretched slowly, arms lifting, spine lengthening, the whole body remembering that it was a body, that it existed in space, that it was capable of movement, and grateful for the reminder. A few last cherry blossoms fell from the tree as she moved, disturbed perhaps by the small change in the air her rising had created, drifting past her in the unhurried way they had been drifting all morning, each one making its own particular peace with the ground. She looked at the garden once more before leaving it. She wanted to keep it, the whole of it, the bench and the tree and the rose bushes with their closed, secret buds, and the hornbeam hedge, and the pale stone wall, and the way the light fell across all of it in the early afternoon with a warmth that was different from the morning's light, deeper and more golden, less tentative, more sure of itself. She kept it the only way she knew how to keep anything, by looking at it fully, by giving it her complete and undivided attention for one long, quiet moment, allowing it to be received not just by her eyes, but by all of her, so that it could settle somewhere deep enough to last. Then she turned and walked back through the garden toward the steps. The city was waiting. She could feel this, the particular pull of an afternoon in a city you are learning for the first time. The sense of streets not yet walked, and corners not yet turned, and small, unpredictable discoveries waiting in the lanes below. It was not an urgent pull. It had none of the anxiety that anticipation sometimes carries. It was more like an invitation, easy, unhurried, entirely without pressure. The kind of invitation that is extended with open hands and is equally happy to be accepted now or later or whenever you are ready. Because the thing being offered is not going anywhere. She descended the steps slowly. The city spread below her as she went down, reassembling itself from the panorama she had seen on the way up into the individual, specific, close-up reality of lanes and buildings. And the smell of coffee and the sound of voices and the cobblestones rising to meet her feet with their familiar, uneven welcome. By the time she reached the bottom of the steps, she was back inside the city rather than above it, surrounded by its textures and its sounds, held within it rather than looking down upon it. And this felt right, felt like the correct relationship to have with a city in the afternoon, when the day has warmed and opened and is ready to be walked through rather than merely observed. She had no map. She had made this decision before she came, or rather, it had made itself, the way certain decisions do when they are really just the recognition of something you already know. Maps were useful things, necessary things, things she was glad existed in the world. But maps organized space according to a logic that was not always the logic of experience. Maps told you where things were, but not what things felt like, not what a street smelled like in the early afternoon, or what the light did to the face of a particular building at a particular hour. Maps were the skeleton of a place. She was interested in the living thing, the warmth and the texture, and the unpredictable aliveness of it. She walked. The afternoon lanes of Montmartre were different from the morning lanes. The morning had been quiet, held close to itself, still finding its way into the day. The afternoon was more open, more inhabited, the neighborhood going about its business with the relaxed confidence of a place that has passed through the morning and arrived at the easier hours. Shops that had been shuttered or tentative were now open and sure of themselves. Voices were more frequent, conversations from open windows, the particular music of French spoken at the pace of daily life rather than the slower, more considered pace of formal address, quick and unself-conscious, and full of the small sounds that language makes when it is being used by people who love it. She walked without direction. She turned when she felt like turning. She slowed when something caught her attention, and stopped when stopping felt right, and walked on when she was ready. And the city received all of this, her stopping and her starting, her turning and her lingering, with the equanimity of a place that has accommodated every possible kind of walker, and long ago stopped having preferences about how people moved through it. She found the bookshop on a lane she had not been on before. It announced itself quietly. A small sign above the door, dark wood with gilt lettering, the gilding worn in places, so that some of the letters were more suggested than stated. The shop's name a matter of inference as much as reading. The window was full of books, stacked, leaned, arranged in the particular semi-organized way of bookshop windows that are tended by people who love books more than they love order, which is to say, arranged with a deep underlying logic that was not immediately visible, but was certainly there. She went to the window first. She stood close to the glass and looked at the books on display. French novels mostly, their spines facing outward in various states of fatting, some so worn she could barely make out the titles, others still vivid, the colors bright and declarative. There were a few older books with covers that suggested a different era's idea of design, geometric and slightly severe, very beautiful in the way that designed things from the mid-20th century are often beautiful, the beauty of a time that believed in clarity and was not yet embarrassed by its own convictions. There was a small stack of poetry collections in the corner of the window, their spines thin and their covers plain, the modesty of their presentation a kind of statement in itself. She pushed open the door and went inside. The smell arrived before anything else. It was the smell of old books, that specific and irreplaceable smell that is not simply the smell of paper and ink, but something more complex, more layered, the smell of time itself in its more benign manifestations, the smell of words that have been read and reread and handled and thought about and carried around and left on bedside tables and opened at 3 in the morning and closed again and kept. It was a warm smell and a slightly dusty smell, and a smell that contained within it something of every room these books had ever occupied, every hand that had ever turned their pages, every mind that had ever moved through their sentences. She breathed it in. She was the only customer. The proprietor, a woman of perhaps 60, with silver hair cut close and small, precise hands, and reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead in the way of someone who puts them there to look at something, and then forgets to bring them back down, looked up briefly from the book she was reading at the counter, nodded once in greeting, and returned to her page. This was exactly right. This was the correct relationship between bookshop proprietor and browser. The acknowledgement of presence, the signal of welcome, and then the gift of being left entirely alone. She began to walk along the shelves. She did not read French well enough to follow a novel. Her French was the French of someone who has studied it at a distance, who can read a menu and make herself understood in a cafe, and catch the general drift of a conversation without catching its particular current. It was not the French of literature, of the interior life of characters, of the specific and irreplaceable music of a sentence written by someone who has spent their whole life in the language and has learned to make it do things that no translation can quite follow. But she could run her fingers along the spines. She did this slowly, beginning at the left end of the first shelf and moving right, not reading the titles carefully, not stopping to examine any particular book, just moving along the row with her fingers trailing lightly across the spines, feeling their textures. Cloth and paper and leather, and the smooth plasticized covers of more recent editions, and the soft, almost furry texture of very old cloth that has absorbed years of handling. Each book a slightly different width, a slightly different resistance under her fingertips. The row of them together, this long, various, densely packed row of human thought and feeling and imagination, each volume representing someone's attempt to say something true in a form that would outlast the moment of its saying, seemed to her, in this quiet afternoon bookshop, an almost overwhelming thing. She stopped at a book whose spine was a particular shade of blue. She could not have explained why this blue stopped her hand. It was just a color, a deep, slightly grayed blue, the blue of the sea on an overcast day, or the sky just after the sun has set, a blue with depth and seriousness, a blue that looked as if it had thought about being blue and arrived at it as a considered conclusion rather than an accident. She pulled the book from the shelf. It was a novel. She could see that much from the title page, though the author's name and the title itself were unknown to her. The pages were slightly yellowed at their edges, the paper the warm ivory of age rather than the harsh white of new printing. She fanned the pages gently, and they made that sound, that specific, quiet, rushing sound of pages being fanned in a bookshop, a sound that she had loved since childhood, and that never failed to produce in her a small, uncomplicated happiness. She could not read it. She put it back on the shelf, carefully, replacing it in exactly the gap it had left, settling it back among its neighbors with a care that felt appropriate, and continued along the row. She bought nothing, or she had thought she would buy nothing, had come in with no intention of purchasing, had told herself she was only browsing, only visiting, only paying her respects to the idea of the place. But at the very back of the shop, on a low shelf near the floor that required crouching to examine, she found a small section of art books and postcards and prints. And among them, in a flat wooden box that held them loosely upright, a collection of watercolor postcards, small reproductions of paintings of Paris, each one no bigger than a playing card, each one painted in the loose, suggestive style of someone who had looked very hard at the city and then looked away and painted what remained in the mind after the looking. She went through them one by one. They were beautiful, not in the polished, perfect way of professional illustration, but in the more interesting way of things made quickly and honestly, made in the presence of the thing being painted rather than from memory or reference, made with the hand moving fast enough that the mind could not interfere too much with what the eye was seeing. Each one caught something true, the angle of light on a particular corner, the weight of a particular building against a particular sky, the way water in a Paris gutter reflects the color of the stone above it, the intimate, accidental geometry of a Montmartre roofline against clouds. She found the Sacré-Cœur. It was painted in the palette of this morning, pale violet and gray. The white stone of the basilica rendered not in white, but in the suggestion of white. The color arrived at through many layered washes of the most delicate blue-gray, so that the building seemed to be made of light as much as stone, to be hovering slightly above the hill rather than sitting solidly on it, to be as much atmosphere as architecture. The sky behind it was the softest possible lilac, barely there, a color that existed at the very edge of color's ability to be seen. She held it for a long moment. Then she bought it. She paid at the counter, and the proprietor wrapped it in a small piece of tissue paper and then placed it in a paper bag, doing all of this with the same quiet efficiency with which she had returned to her book the moment the transaction was complete. And Leah thanked her in her uncertain French, and the woman said something brief and warm that she understood as "you're welcome," even if she could not have transcribed every word. And she went back out into the afternoon. The crepe cart was on the square. She smelled it before she saw it, that warm, slightly sweet smell of batter cooking on a hot iron surface, combined with the richer, deeper smell of whatever was being made. Butter, honey, the faintest edge of caramelization where the heat was highest. She followed the smell the way you follow a sound you want to find the source of, not hurrying, but moving with a gentle purposefulness around a corner and into the broader space of a small square where the afternoon light fell more generously, the buildings drawing back enough to allow the sun to reach the cobblestones and warm them. The cart was old and painted dark red. The man operating it was perhaps 50, with a gray mustache and an apron flour-dusted to a pale ghost of its original color. And he worked with the efficient, practiced ease of someone who has made many thousands of crepes and has reduced the process to its essentials, the ladle moving in a perfect arc across the iron, the spreading tool following in a continuous, unhesitating spiral. The whole operation taking perhaps 30 seconds from pour to finished circle of pale, slightly lacy batter. She ordered one with honey. He made it without hurry, the batter spreading and setting, the edges crisping slightly and lifting. The whole thing folded once, and then again into a neat triangle. Honey drizzled from a small jar with a practiced hand, neither too little nor too much. He wrapped it in a paper napkin and handed it to her, and she paid and stepped away from the cart and stood on the cobblestones of the square and ate it there in the afternoon sun. The honey was extraordinary, not in any complicated way. It was just honey, just the simple thing, the thing that bees made and people had eaten for longer than history could record. But it was very good honey, dark and fragrant, with a depth that suggested the flowers it had come from, a faint, complex sweetness that was not just sweet, but warm, almost spiced, the way the best honey is, as if the bees had gathered something of the sun along with the pollen, combined with the slight crispness of the crepe and the butter that had gone into the batter. It was the kind of food that required nothing to accompany it and no commentary afterward, only the eating of it slowly in the sun. She ate slowly. She looked at the square while she ate. It was a square that had clearly served many purposes over many years and was currently serving the purpose of being a pleasant place to stand in the afternoon. That most undervalued of urban purposes, the purpose of simply providing space for people to be. 3 children were doing something complicated with a ball near the far wall, a game whose rules were not apparent from the outside, but were clearly understood by all 3 participants, the ball moving between them in a pattern that seemed simultaneously random and deliberate. An elderly man was asleep on a bench, his head fallen slightly to one side, his hands folded on his chest with the peaceful arrangement of someone who has fallen asleep in the sun and has no intention of waking up soon. A young woman sat on the low wall at the square's edge, reading, or had been reading. The book was now closed on her lap, and her face was lifted toward the sun, eyes shut, simply receiving. And there was the accordion. She heard it before she found its source, a few notes first, tentative, as if the player were finding the key, and then the full sound, opening out into the afternoon air with the particular richness of the accordion, that instrument of impossible nostalgia, that instrument that sounds like memory feels, like the emotion of remembering rather than the memory itself. She turned toward it. He was younger, than she would have expected from the confidence and ease of his playing. Perhaps 20 or 22. Sitting on a wooden crate in the mouth of a narrow alley that opened onto the square. His instrument held with the casual comfort of a person for whom the instrument has become an extension of the body. He was playing something she did not recognize, a melody that was his own, or was so old it had become everyone's. A slow, slightly melancholy thing that was not sad exactly, but was something more interesting than sad. Something that held both sadness and its opposite simultaneously in the same phrase. The way certain things do, the way autumn does, the way the last light of a long day does. The notes moved through the afternoon air. They drifted down the alley and across the square, and mixed with the smell of the crepe cart and the sound of the children's game and the warmth of the sun on the cobblestones. They were not performing, or rather, the music was not performing, was not asking for attention or applause, was simply occurring, the way the light and the warmth were simply occurring. A natural part of the afternoon rather than an addition to it. She finished her crepe. She stood for a while and listened. The accordion continued, the slow melody finding its way through its own unhurried development, never arriving at any conclusion, because it was not interested in conclusions, interested only in the continuing, in the particular quality of sound that this instrument made in this alley, on this afternoon, in this city. The day had no sharp edges. She felt this as she stood there, the absolute edgelessness of it, the way the morning had become afternoon, and the afternoon was now deepening toward evening with no hard transitions, no moments of rupture, just the continuous, breathing flow of a day that had been, from its very beginning, entirely without urgency. Every moment had flowed into the next, the way water finds its way between stones, not forced, not directed, finding its own natural path through the landscape of the hours, following the shape of things rather than trying to impose a shape upon them. She had done nothing remarkable today. This thought arrived without judgment, without the slight anxiety that such a thought might carry on other days, in other contexts, where not doing anything remarkable could feel like a failure or a waste. Today it arrived simply as a fact, and the fact felt good, felt like exactly the right description of exactly the right kind of day. She had walked, she had sat, she had drunk coffee and eaten a lemon tart and climbed steps and found a garden and watched petals fall and run her fingers along the spines of books she could not read and bought a small watercolor postcard and eaten a crepe with honey in the afternoon sun and listened to a young man play the accordion in an alley. None of it was remarkable. All of it was everything. She reached into her bag and touched the paper bag that held the postcard, just touched it briefly, feeling the slight stiffness of the paper bag, and through it, the small, flat rectangle of the postcard inside. It was there. The morning was there. Inside that small square of watercolor, the pale violet sky and the gray-white stone, and the light that was the city's own particular light, different from any other light she had known, softer and more considered, and more full of the awareness of itself, as if Paris knew it was beautiful and had decided long ago to simply be that, without apology and without performance, for as long as the light lasted. The accordion played on. The children continued their game. The elderly man slept on his bench in the sun, hands folded, face peaceful, entirely elsewhere, and she stood in the square of an afternoon in April in Montmartre, with honey on her fingers and a small painting in her bag, and the notes of an accordion in the air around her, and the cobblestones warm beneath her feet, and the whole of the city spreading itself in every direction around her, old and various and entirely, patiently, inexhaustibly itself. She thought of nothing. She was aware of everything. The afternoon held her as gently as the morning had, as gently as this city seemed to hold everything that came to it with open hands and no particular agenda. Everything that arrived willing to slow down and receive what was being offered. She was that. She had been that all day. She had arrived in Paris willing to slow down, willing to receive, and Paris had given her everything it had, which was, she understood now, not monuments or famous views or experiences to be checked off a list, but something simpler and more essential than any of those things. It had given her the day itself, the full, unhurried, unimproved day, and she had been here for all of it, present for every cobblestone and every petal and every cup and every turning of the light, present in the way she had always wanted to be present for her own life, and had not always managed and was managing now, and would perhaps, after this, manage a little more easily, having remembered what it felt like, having found it again in this old hill neighborhood of this ancient and unhurrying city. The accordion fell quiet. The square breathed. She looked up at the sky, pale blue now, the clouds fewer and higher, the light beginning its first, almost imperceptible shift toward the gold of late afternoon. The first suggestion of evening in the quality of the air, still warm, still gentle, but beginning to carry within it the memory of what comes after warmth. She was not sad about this. She was not sad about anything. She picked up her bag from where she had set it at her feet. She settled it on her shoulder. She looked once more at the square, the children, the sleeping man, the young woman with her closed book and her upturned face, and she felt, with a completeness that surprised her only in how unsurprising it felt, the deep, quiet, entirely undemonstrative happiness of a person who has spent a day exactly as a day should be spent. Then she began, slowly and without hurry, to walk. The lanes of Montmartre received her again, their cobblestones and their walls and their narrowness and their particular afternoon light. And she moved through them the way water moves, the way the day had moved, the way everything in this place seemed to move. Unhurried, present, entirely, quietly here. Rest now. Let the afternoon hold you. Let the accordion carry you softly toward sleep. Crescent moon, the evening, and the quiet walk home. The evening came the way. All the best things came that day. Without announcement. Without the sharp, declarative arrival of something that knows it is important and wants you to know it too. It came the way a tide comes. Gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, the change so slow and so gentle that you could not have pointed to the exact moment it began, could only notice at some point that it had already arrived, that the world around you had shifted while you were not watching it shift, had become something different from what it had been without ever having been anything in between. She noticed it first in the light. She had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes since leaving the square, walking without direction, without destination, moving through the afternoon lanes of Montmartre in the same unhurried, receptive way she had been moving all day. Her attention loose and open, her body comfortable, her mind in that pleasant, slightly suspended state that long, easy walking produces, the state in which thoughts arise and dissolve without needing to be held or followed, like clouds moving through a sky that is not troubled by them. And then the light changed. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of change that announces itself with color and spectacle. Not yet the full golden hour, not the deep amber and rose that would come later. It was subtler than that, the kind of change you feel before you see it. A slight thickening of the air, a slight deepening of the shadows, the afternoon's confident warmth beginning its slow, graceful relinquishment of the day. The light that had been direct and clear and certain of itself for the past several hours became something more oblique, more considered. It came now from a lower angle, catching the faces of the buildings at a new slant, finding details that the overhead light of midday had flattened, restoring depth and texture, and shadow to things that had spent the afternoon in a kind of luminous equality. The stone walls glowed. This was the only word for it, glowed, though it was not a bright glow, not the glow of something lit from within, but the glow of something that had spent all day absorbing warmth and light, and was now, in the gentler illumination of the late afternoon, giving it back. The pale cream and gray stone of the buildings had taken on a warmth it had not had in the morning, a faint suffusion of amber and gold that was not the stone's own color, but was, in this light, completely convincing, completely beautiful, completely right. She stopped walking. She stood in the middle of a lane she did not know the name of, and looked at the buildings on either side, their warm stone faces, their shuttered windows, the way the evening light fell across them in long, softened rectangles that shifted slightly as the clouds above moved. And she felt the full weight of the beauty of it settle on her, not heavily, not with any sensation of burden, but with the specific gravity of things that are genuinely beautiful, the weight that beautiful things have when you allow yourself to receive them completely, rather than passing them quickly with a glance. She stood there for a while. The lane was quiet. A cat crossed somewhere further up. She caught the movement at the edge of her vision. A quick, fluid shape disappearing into a doorway. And then the lane was still again. The sky above it, framed by the roof lines on either side, had shifted from the pale blue of the afternoon to something more complex. A blue that was no longer entirely blue, that had begun to accept into itself the first traces of something warmer, the first whisper of what the evening sky would become. She breathed in, she breathed out, then she began, slowly, to make her way back toward the hotel. She did not know exactly where the hotel was from here. She had not been keeping track, had deliberately not been keeping track, had walked the afternoon lanes as she had walked the morning lanes, without orientation, without the running map that the anxious mind likes to maintain, the constant low-level awareness of where you are in relation to where you need to be. She knew the hotel was somewhere on the lower slopes of the hill. She knew she would find it. Montmartre was not so large that you could truly lose yourself in it. And even if you could, she thought, even if she walked these lanes for another hour without finding anything familiar, she would not have minded. Being lost here did not feel like a problem. It felt like a possibility. She walked toward the hill's lower slopes. The city accompanied her as she went. This was how it felt, not that she was walking through the city, but that the city was walking with her, that it had been walking with her all day, beside her and around her, and occasionally ahead of her, showing her things, offering things, setting things in her path not to impress or overwhelm, but simply to share, the way a person who loves a place shares it with someone new, not with the anxious helpfulness of a tour guide trying to ensure you see everything, but with the easy generosity of someone who has lived somewhere long enough to know that the best things reveal themselves to those who are patient, and who trusts that you will find them if you are paying attention. She was paying attention. The lamp posts came on. This happened gradually, lane by lane, as she descended. A soft click, and then a warm yellow circle appearing on the cobblestones, overlapping with the next circle further down the lane, creating a long, gentle chain of light that was nothing like the harsh brightness of modern street lighting, but was instead the older, more forgiving light of something designed for comfort rather than efficiency. The light was the color of old honey, amber and warm, and it lay on the wet cobblestones. The stones had been wet all day from last night's rain, and had never quite fully dried in the shade of the narrow lanes, in long, wavering reflections, pools of warmth that made the stones beneath them look almost liquid, as if the lane were a slow river of dark water with light moving through it. She walked through these pools of light. She felt each one as she entered it, the slight, imaginary warmth of moving from shadow into the lamp's glow. The cobblestones beneath her feet briefly illuminated in greater detail, every small variation of their surface visible for a moment, and then left behind as she walked on into the next shadow and the next pool. The evening sounds were different from the afternoon sounds. The city had changed its register as the day declined. The quick, businesslike sounds of the active afternoon, the voices and the delivery vehicles, and the purposeful footsteps of people with things to do, had given way to something slower and more domestic. The sounds of a neighborhood settling into its evening. She could hear from various windows and various floors the specific sounds of households arranging themselves for dinner, the rhythmic sound of a knife on a wooden board, the sound of a pan on a stove, a tap running and then stopping, music playing somewhere at a level that was barely music and was more like the idea of music, a television in a distant room. These were sounds she knew, sounds she could have heard from any residential street in any city in the world, sounds that were the same everywhere because they belonged not to any particular place, but to the universal human business of feeding yourself and the people you love at the end of a day. They comforted her. She did not know why exactly. Why the sound of a stranger's knife on a stranger's cutting board in a stranger's kitchen should produce in her such a clean, uncomplicated feeling of warmth. Perhaps because it was the sound of ordinary life continuing, of the day resolving into its evening, the way all days resolved everywhere. The world full of people returning to their kitchens and their tables and their families at the end of the afternoon. The great, unhurried rhythm of it, all moving forward without drama and without urgency, sustaining itself through the simple and repeated acts of cooking and eating and being together. She turned a corner and found herself in a lane she recognized. Not immediately, it came to her slowly, the way recognition sometimes comes, the sense of something familiar arriving before you can name what it is, the feeling of having been somewhere before settling over the place, like a transparency laid over a map. And then she saw the flower cart, the the one she had passed in the taxi that morning, the florist with the scarf and the lilac bunches, and knew where she was. She was close, but she did not hurry. She walked along the lane toward the cart, which was still there, still attended. The day's flowers somewhat diminished from the morning's abundance, but still present. The lilac she had noticed from the taxi, now slightly more open than it had been, its small flowers releasing more freely in the afternoon warmth. The scent reaching her now, as it had not been able to reach her through the glass of the taxi. She stopped at the cart. The florist was the same young man, the scarf still there, the cigarette behind his ear replaced by a different cigarette, which she suspected had also been behind his ear for some time. He looked up when she stopped, with the pleasant, unhurried attention of a person whose business requires them to notice when someone pauses at their stall, but who has long since stopped reading urgency or obligation into the pausing. She bought the lilac. She had known she would buy it since the moment she had seen it from the taxi, many hours and a whole day ago, though she had not let herself plan it or think about it too deliberately, had let it remain as a possibility, a small and open intention held loosely throughout the day. And now here it was, the intention meeting its moment in the most natural way, without effort or arrangement. He wrapped the stems in paper deft, quick, the paper folded and twisted at the bottom with the practiced efficiency of someone who has wrapped 1,000 bunches. He handed it to her. She paid him. He said something in French, something brief and warm, a pleasantry she only half caught. And she smiled and said merci, and turned away with the lilac in her hands. She held it carefully. The stems were cool and slightly damp against her palms. They had been in water all day and still held the memory of it, a freshness that was almost cold, pleasant against skin that had been warm from walking. And the scent. She lowered her face toward the flowers and breathed in the full, sweet, green smell of lilac, that smell that is somehow both very old and entirely immediate, the smell of every spring that has ever happened compressed into a single breath. It was the smell she had imagined from the taxi that morning, and it was better than the imagining, because imagined smells are always slightly abstract, slightly theoretical, and this smell was entirely real, entirely here, filling her lungs with something so clean and sweet and alive that for a moment she simply stood on the cobblestones of the lamplit lane with her eyes closed and breathed. She opened her eyes. She walked on. The hotel was 2 lanes away. She took the longer route. This was a decision she made without deliberating about it. A slight turning away from the most direct path, a choosing of the lane that curved rather than the lane that went straight, an extension of the walk by perhaps 5 minutes, perhaps 10, because the evening was beautiful and she was in it. and she was not ready to stop being in it quite yet. The lamp posts lit her way in their amber pools. The cobblestones spoke quietly beneath her shoes. The lilac scented the air around her with every few steps. A small, private fragrance accompanying her through the evening lane. She passed a window. It was a ground floor window, its curtains not yet drawn, and through the glass she could see into a room, not intrusively, not with any sense of looking where she should not, but the way you see into rooms from the street when you are walking at evening, and the interior light makes the rooms briefly visible, briefly shared with the outside world before the curtains close and the evening becomes private. The room was small and warm. There was a table with 2 chairs, and at the table, a man and a woman were sitting together, sitting with the ease and the slight inattentiveness of people who have eaten many meals at this same table and have long since stopped needing to perform the act of being together, who can simply be together without arrangement or self-consciousness. The woman was talking, her hands moving slightly as she spoke, and the man was listening in the way of someone who is genuinely interested in what the other person is saying, leaning forward very slightly, his head tilted, his face attentive. There was a candle on the table, not lit yet, but there, waiting for the evening to deepen enough to require it. There were glasses of wine, red wine, dark in the candlelight. She saw all of this in the few seconds the window allowed her. Then she had walked past, and the window was behind her, and the room had returned to itself, private and complete. The 2 people at the table continuing their conversation in the warm interior light, unaware of having been witnessed, unaware of the woman in the evening lane who had looked through their window for 3 seconds and carried away the image of them, the candle and the wine, and the particular quality of their attention to each other, as one more small, unremarkable, entirely precious thing from this day. She turned the last corner, and there was the lane. Her lane, she thought of it as hers now, after the morning and the afternoon, and the whole long, unhurried day. The hotel's lane, narrow and cobblestoned and lamplit, the buildings on either side leaning slightly toward each other in their old and companionable way. She stopped at the corner and looked down its length, the pools of amber light, the shadows between them, the dark green of the hotel's shutters visible partway down, the wooden door with its worn paint, the brass plaque. She paused, not because she needed to pause, not because she was gathering herself or preparing for anything. She paused because the lane was beautiful in the evening light, and she wanted to see it, to really see it, the way she had been seeing things all day, with the full and undivided attention that things deserve and so rarely receive. The way the lamp light lay on the cobblestones, the way the buildings' pale faces had deepened to gold in the evening, the way the shadows were soft, not harsh, full of the complexity of evening light rather than the simplicity of darkness. She stood and looked. Above the lane, the sky had completed its transformation. It was the color now of something between blue and gray and the softest possible rose. The sky that exists only in the few minutes between the end of day and the beginning of night. The sky that belongs to neither and partakes of both. That holds the memory of the sun in its lower layers, while the upper layers deepen toward the first darkness. It was the most beautiful sky she had seen all day, which was saying a great deal, because the sky had been beautiful all day in various and generous ways. But this sky, this specific, unrepeatable, briefly existing sky above the narrow lane, was the most beautiful because it was also the last, the day's final offering, the closing gesture of a day that had been nothing but gestures of generosity from beginning to end. She breathed it in. She smelled the lilac in her hands. She smelled the evening city, the layered, complex smell of it, different now from the morning smell, warmer and denser and more domestic, carrying within it all the cooking and the warmth and the lived-in quality of a neighborhood settling into its night. Garlic, butter, something roasting, the faint, sweet ghost of someone's dessert. The old stone, cooling now as the warmth of the day began to leave it, giving back its stored heat to the evening air in a slow, almost imperceptible exhalation. She heard voices. Above her, from a window she could not see directly, somewhere on the second or third floor of one of the buildings on her left, a woman was singing. Or not quite singing. It was lower than singing, less formal, more private, the sound of someone humming to themselves while they did something else. The half-conscious music that people make when they are alone and comfortable, and their mind is elsewhere, and their voice moves without being asked. It was a melody she did not recognize, or almost did not recognize. There was something in the shape of it that felt faintly familiar, like a phrase from a song she had heard a long time ago in a different version. Or perhaps it was nothing she had heard before, and the familiarity was of a different kind. The familiarity of things that are simply true, that have the quality of having always existed. She listened. The humming continued for a few moments, clear and soft, and entirely unconscious of being heard. And then it stopped, mid-phrase, as if the person had moved to another room or been distracted by something, or simply, having hummed what they needed to hum, had allowed the music to complete itself in silence. The lane was quiet. She walked down it. Her footsteps on the cobblestones were the same sound they had been all day. That low, soft, rhythmic contact between her shoes and the old stone. The sound that was also a feeling. The slight give of the stone under each step. The lane receiving her weight and returning it gently. She had walked a great deal today, and her feet knew this. There was a pleasant tiredness in them. The tiredness that is not exhaustion, but its milder, more comfortable cousin, the tiredness of a body that has been used well and is ready for rest. She passed a window box. It was on the second floor of the building on her right. She looked up at it as she walked beneath it, the way she had been looking up at things all day. The box was white painted wood, and in it were geraniums, white geraniums, their flowers small and clustered, their leaves dark green with the slight furriness of the geranium leaf that you can feel without touching. And from the window above the box, a woman's arm extended, bare to the elbow, the hand holding a small watering can, tilted so that a thin stream of water fell from its spout into the window box in a perfect, glinting arc, catching the last of the evening light as it fell. The woman was humming. It was the same melody. She recognized it now. The same half song she had heard moments ago from further up the lane. So the woman had not moved to another room. She had come to the window to water her geraniums, and she was humming as she did it. This small, necessary evening act, watering the flowers before the night came, giving them their drink at the end of the day, with the same quiet, unself-conscious music she brought to everything, her arm extending gracefully from the window, the water falling in its arc, her voice barely audible but present, threading through the evening air of the lane. Leah stopped beneath the window box. She looked up at the falling water, the white geraniums receiving it, the woman's arm moving the can slightly to distribute the water evenly across the soil. From this angle, she could not see the woman's face, only the arm, and a suggestion of shoulder, and the line of the window frame. But she could hear the humming, very close now, low and warm, and entirely at home in itself. She stood there until the watering was done. The arm withdrew. The window closed, not quickly, not with any sense of shutting out the evening, but slowly, and with the quiet finality of a day concluding its business. The humming faded. The lane was quiet again. She walked the last few steps to the hotel door. She paused with her hand on the handle. She was not ready to go in, not quite, not yet, not for another moment. She turned and looked back at the lane, the amber light on the cobblestones, the buildings leaning toward each other with their centuries of patience, the small bright stars of lamp light reflected in the puddles that still lingered in the lower corners where the rain had settled, the evening sky above it all, deepening now toward its first true darkness, the rose entirely gone, only the soft gray-blue remaining, and above that, just visible, the first stars, faint and tentative, as if they were not yet entirely sure the darkness had committed to lasting. She looked at all of it. She thought, with the same quiet simplicity with which she had thought things all day, without drama, and without the need for anything more than the thought itself. She thought, I will not forget this. Not the monuments, not the famous views, not the postcard images that she had seen 100 times before arriving and would see 100 times more after leaving. She would not forget those things either, but they were not what she meant. She meant this lane, this evening, these cobblestones, the woman's arm and the falling water, and the geraniums, and the amber light, and the sound of her own footsteps moving through the day from morning to this moment, this door handle cool under her palm, this bundle of lilac in her other hand, this particular and unrepeatable evening in a neighborhood of an old city that had given her, without being asked, and without requiring anything in return, a day she would carry inside her for a long time. She pushed open the door. The warmth of the hotel's interior received her, a gentle warmth, the warmth of an enclosed space that has been lived in and heated and cared for, carrying within it the slight mingling of scents that old hotels carry, wood polish, and the faint ghost of coffee and something laundry clean, the smell of a place that has been making people comfortable for a long time and has learned how to do it without effort. The woman at the reception desk looked up. She smiled, that same real smile from the morning, the smile that reached the eyes. She said something in French that Leia understood as, "You had a good day." And Leia said, in her uncertain French, the words arriving more easily now than they had that morning, loosened perhaps by the day's ease, "Yes, a very good day." The woman nodded, as if this were exactly what she had expected to hear. Leia climbed the narrow stairs. The staircase was steep, and the banister was smooth under her hand. Smooth, with the particular smoothness of wood that has been touched by many hands over many years, worn to a finish that no craftsman could replicate, that only time and contact could produce. She ran her palm along it as she climbed and felt the accumulated warmth of all those hands in the wood. All those people climbing these same stairs at the end of their own days in this city, their own days of walking and looking and receiving and being held by this place. She reached the landing. She found her room. The key turned in the lock with the slight resistance of an old lock, a resistance that gave way cleanly once the key found its position. The door opening into the small room with its cream walls and its white bed linen and its single window looking out over the lane. She crossed to the window. She opened it. The evening air entered immediately, cool now, properly cool, the warmth of the day almost entirely gone. The air carrying that particular crispness of an April night in a northern city, clean and slightly sharp. The kind of air that makes the inside of a warm room feel more warm by contrast, that makes the white pillow on the white bed look, from across the room, like the most welcoming thing you have ever seen. She stood at the window for a long moment, Below her, the lane continued its evening, the lamp posts doing their amber work, a couple walking arm in arm along the cobblestones, their voices low and unhurried, the woman laughing at something, the sound of it rising to the window and dissolving into the night air. Somewhere further away, a door opened and closed. The city's distant murmur continued its eternal, undifferentiated presence, the sound of millions of lives happening simultaneously, the great constant hum of a city that never entirely sleeps. She placed the lilac on the windowsill. Its scent moved into the room on the cool air, faint and sweet and entirely, exactly right, the smell of the day's end, the smell of a lane in Montmartre in the evening, the smell of spring in an old city that had been receiving springs for longer than she could imagine, and had not yet tired of them. She turned from the window. She set her bag down on the chair. She took out the paper bag from the bookshop and placed it on the small table, the postcard inside it, the watercolor of Sacré-Cœur in pale violet and gray, carrying within its small rectangle of painted paper the whole morning, the whole day, the whole quality of light that had been the day's companion from beginning to end. She sat on the edge of the bed. She sat very still for a moment. She was tired, the good tiredness, the earned tiredness, the tiredness of a body that has walked and climbed and stood and been present for a long and beautiful day. It was in her legs and her feet and her shoulders and the muscles behind her eyes, the pleasant, warm, specific tiredness of a person who has used themselves well and is ready to rest. She lay down, not fully. She did not remove her shoes, did not pull back the covers, did not do any of the deliberate things of getting into bed. She simply lay back against the white pillow with her arms loose at her sides and let the ceiling of the small room exist above her, cream and slightly uneven. The evening light from the window laying a soft, moving pattern across it as the curtains shifted in the faint breeze. She listened to the city. It was breathing outside the window. That was how it sounded, how it had always sounded since she arrived, not as noise, but as breathing, the long, slow respiration of a living thing, in and out, the sounds rising and falling, voices and footsteps, and the distant, occasional sound of a car, and the murmur of lives being lived, and all of it together making something that was not quite music and not quite silence, but something in between, something that held both within it, the way the evening sky held both day and night. The lilac scented the room. The curtains moved in the breeze from the open window. The lamp light from the lane below made small, slow patterns on the ceiling. She breathed in and out, in and out, each breath a little slower than the last, a little deeper, a little more entirely given over to the simple act of breathing, of being a body at rest in a warm room at the end of a long and beautiful day. She had done nothing remarkable. She had done everything. The city breathed outside the window, patient, continuous, ancient, alive. It had been breathing like this for longer than she could hold in her mind, and it would go on breathing long after this particular April evening had dissolved into the deep, uncountable accumulation of all the evenings that had ever happened here. But this evening was hers. This room, this light, this lilac on this windowsill.